Morning history classes. It is Wednesday, April 8th. Um, Today we are getting back into the 60s yet again, getting toward the later 60s and actually into the 1970s. Um, it's been pointed out before that what we talk about as being the 60s, if you associate the 60s with the hippies and the counterculture and flower children in Vietnam, what we're really talking about is the time period from 1965 to about 1975. That's when all that was really going on. In about 1976, we get the transition into disco and things like that. So, anyway, starting in about 1968, again, this is the kind of the big change year that we've been talking about. We've got uh, Dr. King's assassination in Memphis, April 4th, 1968, which again we're going to talk about in the coming weeks when we get more into the civil rights era. Uh, Assassination of Bobby Kennedy, the Tet Offensive, and then, of course, my birth in December of that year. Um, but another big thing that happens in 1968 is, of course, the election of 1968. We've had an incumbent president, Lyndon Johnson, who had won election in 1964 after filling in for John Kennedy's the remainder of Kennedy's term after his assassination. But then in 1968, Johnson decides not to run for re-election, primarily because of the opposition to his policy toward Vietnam. And so we have a situation where in 1968, then Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate, wins the presidency. Um, and so he takes office January of 1969 with a kind of doubling down policy toward Vietnam. Um, the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago was a huge riot, basically. There were police in the streets of Chicago clamping down on protesters, protesting the Vietnam War at the Democratic Convention, and that kind of chaos just sort of reigned through the rest of the Democratic Party for that election. So then we have Richard Nixon coming in 1969. And we're going to talk more about the 1968 election tomorrow. So Nixon comes in talking about getting out of Vietnam. Uh, the subhead in the book in this chapter says Nixon starts the pullout. Nixon's defenders argued that he was a hardworking patriot with a new vision for America. His critics charged that he was a deceitful politician bent on acquiring power and punishing his enemies. And of course, we're going to get into talking about Watergate soon, too. There were elements of truth to both views, but defenders and critics alike agreed that Richard Nixon was a determined man with abundant political talent. From his first day in office, the new president realized that ending the Vietnam War was the key to everything else he had hoped to achieve. Sorry, I got a big hank of dog fur here. My dog is blowing coat, so. Okay, though formal peace talks between the warring parties had begun in May 1968, they were bogged down from the outset by disagreements and a lack of compromise. When Richard Nixon took office in January 1969, his peace delegation firmly believed they could break the impasse. The Americans and South Vietnamese wanted all communist troops out of South Vietnam. They also wanted prisoners of war, or POWs, returned. Meanwhile, the North Vietnamese demanded an immediate American withdrawal from Vietnam and the formation of a coalition government in South Vietnam that would include representatives from the Viet Cong. Still hoping to win the war in the field, North Vietnam refused to budge from its initial position, and South Vietnam refused to sign any agreement that compromised its security. So Nixon's going to come in with a plan. He desperately wants to get out of Vietnam because it's kind of first of all, it's a money pit. Wars are very expensive, and no president wants to have to sink billions upon billions of dollars into anything that doesn't have a clear path to victory. And also, the opposition on the home front to our involvement in Vietnam is growing daily. And we're going to see here in just a moment the effect that it's going to have on the college campuses, particularly at Kent State in Ohio. Okay, President Nixon refused to accept the North Vietnamese peace terms. He was committed to a policy of quote-unquote peace with honor and believed that there were still military options. He continued a gradual pullout of American troops and expressed faith in the ability of the Army of the Republic of Vietnam to assume the burden of war. He called his approach Vietnamization. U.S. troops would withdraw as ARVN troops assumed more combat duties. This is kind of what's been going on over a number of years in Iraq and Afghanistan as we have tried to hand off combat and security operations to their armed forces and draw down the American troop presence there. The hope was that with continued American aid behind the front lines, the ARVN would fight its own battles to secure South Vietnam. To reduce the flow of communist supplies to the Viet Cong, Nixon ordered the secret bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. This was a controversial move because it widened the scope of the war and helped to undermine the neutral government in Cambodia. We were not at war with Cambodia. We were not supposed to be doing anything in Cambodia, but part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was, of course, named after Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam, and was a path or a road that was used to bring supplies from North Vietnam into South Vietnam for use by the Viet Cong. Part of that trail went through Cambodia. So Nixon has the idea that he's going to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. Okay. Cambodia is officially a neutral government at this point. They are not involved in the Vietnam conflict. And, think about other countries in world history that have been officially neutral and yet been involved in wars against their will and how that worked out. Think about Belgium in both world wars. They've been kind of the conduit for the Germans into France in violation of their neutrality, and we're doing the same thing here to Cambodia. In the end, neither Vietnamization nor secret bombings dramatically improved South Vietnam's chances of winning a war against the communists. Okay, troubles on the home front intensify. This is kind of the main thrust of today's lesson. Nixon inherited two things from Lyndon Johnson: an unpopular war and a vocal American opposition to it. The new president wanted peace with honor, security for America's ally South Vietnam, and international respect for U.S. foreign policy. Anti-war activists wanted the war ended and American troops out of Vietnam on any terms. Nixon found it increasingly difficult to achieve his goals and satisfy the snowballing anti-war movement. More than a year into office, Nixon had grown impatient with the snail's pace of the peace negotiations. In 1970, he attempted to break the stalemate by ordering a ground attack on North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong bases in Cambodia. Hello, now we're invading a neutral country. Nixon also hoped to aid the pro-American Cambodian government in its fight against the Khmer Rouge, a communist movement supported by North Vietnam. We'll talk more about the Khmer Rouge later. This is a particularly nasty group of people under a dictator named Pol Pot, who, in fact, I think we may have brought up the Khmer Rouge before when we talked about the suppression of dissidents and the fact that dictatorships generally tend to imprison or execute people wearing glasses. First off, that happened a lot with the Khmer Rouge. On the evening of April 30th, this is in 1970, Nixon addressed the American people, informing them of his decision to carry the war into Cambodia. He stressed that the war had become a measure of how committed the United States was to preserving freedom around the world. And the next morning, U.S. and ARVN forces, remember ARVN is the South Vietnamese Army, crossed the border into Cambodia. These soldiers captured large stockpiles of weapons and supplies, but they did not break the stalemate. North Vietnam remained determined to have peace on its terms or no peace at all. Okay, now we get into some violence on college campuses. This is all in 1970. The Cambodian incursion had a profound impact on the peace movement at home. It stirred anti-war activists who argued that Nixon had widened the war and made the world a more dangerous place. So remember, Nixon's coming in with the kind of stated ideals that he's going to end the war in Vietnam. He's going to end it largely on his terms, but he's going to end it. Now it's widening, and people are starting to get really upset with this. Throughout the country, college campuses erupted with protests. Several demonstrations prompted the police and National Guard to step in to preserve order. You can kind of see where this is going, right? On two campuses, confrontations between students and armed authorities led to deaths. 4 days after Nixon's speech, demonstrators at Kent State University in Ohio threw rocks and bottles at members of the National Guard. When one guardsman thought he heard a sniper's shot, he fired his rifle. The shot prompted other National Guardsmen to discharge a volley of gunfire into a group of protesters, killing 4 youths. Okay. The other part of today's assignment is to listen. I sent you a link to the YouTube recording of Ohio by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young with the lyrics come up on it. This is the incident that song's talking about. 10 soldiers and Nixon coming. We're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. Talking about the Kent State Massacre, this is a huge turning point in American culture and how Americans view the war in Vietnam. Things kind of have this sense that they're really spiraling out of control. And Nixon had come in with the idea that he's going to put everything right, and it's really getting away from him too. The Kent State killings led to demonstrations on other campuses. At Jackson State University, a traditionally African-American college in Mississippi, the confrontation between students and police ended with 2 students dead. Something else I want you to kind of bear in mind, and I know we kind of keep circling back to this this year, is this repeated theme about how people of color have generally been treated differently historically throughout the United States. The 4 kids who were killed at Kent State were all white. You almost never hear about the killings at Jackson State University because those victims were black. And I mean, it happened at almost exactly the same time, but the killings at Kent State get a whole, hit song by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. It becomes this whole political touchstone that is remembered. I mean, I was a toddler at this point, and it still bears a large part of the memory in my mind, even though I have no direct memory of it. But the killings at Jackson State are a different thing. They're largely forgotten. Why? Okay, it's a historically black college. Think about that. Think about why that would be different. Okay. College demonstrations against the war sometimes prompted counter-protests by Americans who supported the president. In response to a May 8, 1970 anti-war rally in downtown New York City, construction workers decided to demonstrate, carrying American flags and chanting "All the Way USA." Believing that some anti-war demonstrators had spit on the American flag, they pushed into the crowd and started hitting protesters. The clash drew national attention. Days later, thousands of construction workers, businessmen, secretaries, and housewives marched peacefully through Manhattan streets in support of Nixon and the war effort. Again, here's this class divide. It's not strictly based on class, but it's going to be largely a class divide. Notice that this is going to start with construction workers, blue-collar guys who are going to be a lot more solidly behind the war effort than the student protesters, who are going to be largely from middle class, upper middle class backgrounds. Okay, we've talked a little bit about that, and that's another one of those divides. The historical divides in the United States aren't solely racial. A lot of them have to do with class, how much money you have, how much money your family has, things like that. Anyway, that is the Kent State protest. Tomorrow we're going to get into the 1968 presidential election. Hope you all are well. Wash your hands, and we'll talk to you soon.